What was life like for you during the separations, the divorce?
It was kind of hell, if I'm being honest. So like that whole time was like the hardest times of my life. Like the tapestry of my life or our family's life is being torn apart. And at the same time, like I couldn't do anything about it. And that was like incredibly helpless. I was kind of an intermediary. I remember a lot of times kind of getting in between mom and dad and trying to like talk them to the other person's side. As a child in that situation, you have this like gut instinct that this is not how things ought to be.
You mentioned anxiety, you mentioned like pressure, stress, but were there any other emotional problems that you experienced through all of that?
I think as a child, what you want to know is like that things are secure, that you're safe. I remember looking out the window and there being like these police cars and you're like, holy shit, like what, like what's going on here?
Welcome to the Restored Podcast. I'm Joey Ponarelli. If you come from a divorced or broken family, this show is for you. We help you heal your brokenness, navigate the challenges, and build healthy relationships so you can break that cycle and build a better life. My guest today is actually my older brother, Anthony. He grew up in the Chicagoland area as the oldest of 6 kids, where he played every sport imaginable. He double majored in philosophy and theology at Franciscan University of Steubenville, where he captained and starred on the baseball team, being awarded the Kuzma Cup as an outstanding scholar athlete. After graduation, Anthony taught theology, he did youth ministry, and coached baseball for several years. He now works in the golf industry as the director of food and beverage operations at a golf club in Illinois. Anthony is a proud uncle and loves spending time with his niece and nephew, actually my kids, and he still enjoys sports, traveling, and in his words, is a degenerate fantasy football player. Really excited for this conversation. If you come from a divorced or broken family, the hardest part is seeing the people that you love suffer. That was true for my brother, for Anthony. He said watching his siblings struggle was the hardest part for him. And in this episode, you'll hear us compare stories of our parents' divorce from our perspectives as siblings. And you'll hear us talk about how divorce is almost always a lose-lose for the children, how Anthony had the sense of this is not how it ought to be. And we talk a little bit about how a family ought to be, how he was automatically made the man of the house when he really shouldn't have been, and the effects of that on him, how he has experienced healing, but how healing is not one size fits all, and the imperfections of certain therapy models, certain therapy types, and a new healing method that's been effective for him. To any parents listening, we talk about some tips on how to talk with your children about your divorce without oversharing. And then Anthony shares how he's struggled in his relationship with God and what he learned that has helped him heal. And so if your parents are divorced or struggling in their marriage and watching your siblings suffer has been the hardest part for you, this episode is especially for you. 2 things before we dive in. You'll hear me share details about my parents' divorce that I don't usually go into as much detail about. And without changing my story, I often simplify it on this show to make it a little bit more concise. But I'm really glad that we were able to dive into those details and I'm able to share those with you guys. And also in this episode, we do talk about God and faith. And if you don't believe in God, you're totally welcome here. Anyone who's been listening to the show for a while knows that this is not a strictly religious podcast. So wherever you're at, I'm glad you're here. If you don't believe in God, my challenge to you is this: just listen with an open mind. Even if you were to skip or take out the God parts, you're still going to learn a lot from this episode. It's still going to benefit you. And so with that, here's our conversation. Welcome on the show. Good to have you here.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me, bud.
You are the first family member to come on the show, so I'm excited to just see things through your perspective. One of the things that I've always heard is like, as a parent, you're never the same parent to each child. And I think it's true, like as a sibling within a family, like you each perceive the family and even your parents differently. So I'm really interested to like learn from you and see maybe how you perceive things differently and I perceive things differently. So yeah, with that, I'm curious from your perspective, what was home like in the years and the months before mom and dad split?
I guess so there was kind of this, kind of waves of, because the original time that, about 10 years prior, mom and dad had split for a while or been separated for a while. And then they got back together and it was kind of like this miraculous reconciliation to some degree, or at least for a while, right?
Totally.
But in terms of like the months prior, maybe not months and years, the months prior were pretty strenuous. I think it all started like when our uncle died in August of 2012. And it kind of put our dad understandably in a very difficult place, dealing with like the second traumatic death in his family in his lifetime. And so, kind of re-triggered all that trauma, and so it brought it up to the surface again, and I think kind of put him in a whirlwind. And then so fast forward like 6 months later, when mom and dad ended up, the filing for the divorce was made. The months before were tense. I remember like when that finally went through, or it finally, like there was finally a separation, just remember realizing, like feeling my body shaking and realizing like I think I've been shaking for like months.
Wow.
Yeah. I just remember this distinct moment of feeling that. And it was was a very difficult period. Like it's, when you're a child in that situation, and at that time I was older, I was in my 20s. So an adult child, you can say, but as a child in that situation, you had this like gut instinct, this like intestinal fortitude that this is not how things ought to be. And like in that whole time, well, pretty much for most of my life, but especially in that whole time, like I really had this is not how things ought to be. This is not how things ought to be. And it's like this disharmony, or this, what do you call it when music, when the notes don't, how the notes go together, but then there's a time when the notes don't go together. I can't think of the term.
Yeah, discordant or disharmonic, or something like that.
Discordant. Yeah, I think it's discordant or something along those lines. Yeah, it's like, musical notes were, like C, A, D minor, all these things were made to go together, but like in different types of music, they play like discordant notes. And that's how it felt like that period, is just like this like discordant notes, this like intestinal sense that like this is not how things ought to be.
That's really good. I think part of the reason that people miss how traumatic divorce and the dysfunction that precedes it can be is because they don't have this like understanding of how things ought to be. Because if family life is whatever you want it to be, or whatever you define it as, there's no like objective standard of what it like should live up to, then I think there's often this perception that like, well, that was not a big deal. It's not a big problem. But obviously the stories that we hear all the time and the research show that. So it's really interesting that you kind of had this thought, this is not how it ought to be. Did you have an idea or understanding of how things ought to be?
Yeah, definitely. Like we were blessed to grow up with some families, particularly one family, right, that I think really, like, you just looked at them and you're like, this is how it's supposed to be, and it kind of was like they're like a beacon of peace amid like the storms of like a troubled marriage, so having that, and then also seeing a bunch of other couples, like I can think of a couple off the top of my head that you're like, look at that, and you see that and you're like, I want that, because that's not what I grew up with. But you just know, like, you don't, it's almost like self-evident truth. Like, you don't need anyone. It's like the little kid who just knows that something isn't fair. That kid couldn't define justice, but they know that something isn't fair. And it's the same thing, like, kind of, I think in those situations, you couldn't define what's wrong particularly, or you couldn't maybe put it into words, but you know it when you see it. Wow. That being the right thing. And I think that was like very much my experience growing up.
Yeah, no, that's super good. Wow. Deep. I definitely see what you're saying. And I thought it might be helpful for everyone listening to maybe go through the timeline as an overview, and feel free to correct or add anything you'd like. So for everyone listening, so our parents actually separated twice, and they actually began a divorce on both occasions, to my knowledge. You can correct that.
You're right, yeah.
Yep. So I was 10, 11 when it first happened, and then you would have been, 13, 14 at that time, about? Yep. So then that was the first instant. They were separated for, a year and a half, I think. That's the knowledge that I had. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, it was pretty much spring of when I was 14, I would say, until like December of when I was 15.
Okay.
Yeah, so that makes sense. About a year and a half. Yeah.
So spring of 2003 to December of 2004.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. I remember it was around their anniversary, actually, that Dad came home. Yeah. So that was like, Anthony mentioned that it was a kind of miraculous event. They went on this retreat. Some of you might be familiar with like the Retrovi retreats. And that was, to my knowledge, like pretty instrumental. Maybe it wasn't the whole picture to bringing them back together, because they, like I said, had started the legal divorce proceedings, whatever, and then they kind of changed course and got back together. The way I always explain it then is that it was good that they were together, but things were very broken, at home within the marriage. And that's not to like pass judgment on our parents. I think they would both describe it that way if they were here right now.
Yeah.
And then fast forward about 10 years. So I am, I think, 20 at the time, or I guess 19 going on 20. And it was August, like you said, of 2012. So I'm 19 at the time. You would have been, what was it? 22
or 23, sorry.
You'd have turned 23 and I was about to turn 20. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
so for context, like I was at home, I went to junior college. I took the semester off, ironically, when our uncle passed away. And that's when, understandably so, it just really weighed on my dad. And that's kind of put the things into motion, like Anthony said before. And then later so that was the fall, that was August. So go into like the spring and March was when the divorce was filed, if I'm remembering right. So that was kind of just the timeline of how things went down. And then our parents went through actually a 3-year divorce process, if I'm getting that right too.
Yeah.
It was very like, I remember someone saying like, a year is about average, 2 years is like very long, 3 years is like insane. And that was the process. So in some way we went through this twice. And each kind of had their particular like struggles and details, which we may or may not get into in depth, but certainly both really difficult and traumatic, I would say. So anyway, with that kind of timeline in place, hopefully that helps you guys understand kind of where we're at in the story. So I'm curious, so you went through kind of what led up to the separation, the divorce. Is there anything else you'd like to add in that, or do you feel like we're at a good spot?
No, I think we're at a pretty good spot. Yeah, I think it was just, of course you can't limit it to like those instances, and nothing is, or almost nothing is, just only sparked by one thing. There's usually a lot of things that play into it. So I'm not as simplistic as saying like our uncle's death started all this, because obviously with the timeline you described, it didn't.
Yeah.
But there's always kind of I think there was, things happening before that definitely contributed. So
yeah, cool. Okay, so just to again reiterate, you were originally 14 when mom and dad split, and then you were 22 when they divorced, or when they started their divorce at least.
Right.
And then and how old are you now?
I'd rather not reveal that. I'm just kidding. I'm 35.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's helpful for context. And for the record, I did know that. And so I guess we'll kind of maybe treat both separations separately. So how did you learn about the separation and the divorce, and what was your reaction to it?
So I learned about it. Mom came to me and told me that she was going to get a divorce, because she was scared. She didn't feel safe. Basically she had kind of reached her wit's end. And so I was, kind of a little bit shocked, but a little bit not surprised. And I'm pretty sure I told her like, yeah, like after a long time of her like talking about it and me saying, don't do it. At this time I was like, yeah, I think you should do it, because things had gotten that bad. And I just remember overhearing some like just conversations that kind of made my blood, like gave me chills, They were kind of just that disturbing, and not something a kid should be hearing, or of any age. And so remember thinking like, well, it couldn't get any worse than this. So maybe a separation or divorce is, not a terrible idea.
Yeah. And I think, I know we're kind of being careful with some of the details just to protect mom and dad for everyone listening, because we don't want to disparage their names, but we're trying to be honest about it too. So it's definitely a difficult line to walk. But so that was like that later instance. And I'm curious about the one earlier on, how you learned about that, because I have kind of a version of the story in my head, but I'm curious if yours, like when you were 14, how did you learn about that? What was your reaction to it?
Yeah, that one, I don't remember. I mean, of course, it's like similar buildup in a certain sense, but I just remember that one kind of crescendoing. And, I remember dad, like, basically kind of like had somewhat moved out. And then one day, mom decided she didn't want him there. And even though he had been coming and going and not really there for a while. And so I think I just have this memory of like, I don't know, like bags of clothes, or like, things being gone. And so that, as a kid, that's hard, like to just like the ambiguity is hard, right? Because like I think as a child, what you want to know is like that things are secure, that you're safe, that things are gonna not change that much in that radical of a way, right? And so like that, the kind of like the coming and going, the where's dad, or why are his clothes out, that was really hard. And yeah, so that's what I remember of that like beginning, right? And then I think there was an incident, and then it led to, it led to basically after that the basically, yeah, the separation for a year and a half, and then I think mom had like a restraining order. And that, that was kind of a tough dynamic because it's like you couldn't talk to your dad and then things like that. So yeah, I don't want to I don't want to go on and on, but that's what I remember of that.
Okay. Yeah, no, I have similar memories. I think one difference, which is interesting to highlight, is that I don't think I was aware of like the beginning stage as much. I think I was a bit, obviously you were older, but I think I was a bit oblivious to it. I don't know if we were told something else was going on or what the deal was, like if dad was just like out working or something like that. But I do remember very clearly, I think it was like a Saturday. I remember I had a baseball game. I remember our neighbors took us out of the house to like the park. And that's when there was, I guess, this situation where like that was dad's like official exit from the house. Without going into many details, I don't think it was violent or anything by any means, but like the police were involved to just like,
Yeah, it wasn't violent at home at least, but I think there was some other situation that had kind of led to the police being there, and that, yeah. And so also, like you mentioned that point, as a young kid, that's like traumatic. Because I remember looking out the window and there being like these police cars, and you're like, holy shit, like what, like what's going on here?
yeah.
And that, that is like very confusing as a young child.
I remember that. I remember that we were intentionally taken from the home, and we'd kind of grown up like around police officers and firemen, and
Right.
kind of looked up to them and understood that their job was like serious. And there were even some instances earlier on where we were like, we helped the police with certain things. We won't go into that. So we kind of understood
we even had a nickname. You remember that?
I do remember that. What was the nickname now that you mentioned? People are wondering.
It was the Ponderelli Crime Stoppers, because there were like these two instances where we caught like crimes in the act or people in places they shouldn't have been.
Yeah.
And so this officer said, "Man, you guys are the Ponderelli Crime Stoppers."
And I think they happened pretty close together, which is funny. And then there's
it
like
was within a short window. Yeah.
Yeah. At the risk of making it sound super heroic, there was like nothing else that happened in our life like outside of that.
It wasn't that big of a deal, but yeah.
Yeah, we probably thought we were Batman, but it was that was, yeah, I remember that. There was like we actually lived in like a pretty nice area. It wasn't like a high end area by any means. I wouldn't say that at least, but it was like, middle class, and there was a house across the street where there was like some sort of drug activity going on. It was kind of an anomaly for the area from what I remember. And we kind of helped them take down that house. So yeah, pretty like we didn't do anything crazy, but we kind of fed information and reported on it. Yeah. So anyway, I did not expect to go into that in this interview, but yeah. So, okay. So yeah, so we had like this context of like police being serious. And then, we went to the park that day, the neighbors took us, and then we came back too soon. I don't know if you remember that, but it was like, we weren't supposed to come back that soon, because that's when we saw the police in the driveway, and we're like, what is going on? Like we thought maybe someone was hurt or something happened. And then I don't think we got many answers from the neighbors. And I remember we went to another park and we're like trying to play. And it was just like, obviously top of mind, at least for probably you and me, maybe Gerard, because for context too, there's 6 kids in the family. I'm number 2 and Anthony's number 1. So Anthony's 1, I'm 2, and then Gerard would be red and dress, and the other siblings won't go into as much right now. But anyway, so that day, I remember when we came home that day, that's when mom kind of explained what was going on. Did she explain anything to you prior to that? I'm curious.
Yeah, she did. And so I had kind of known, I think honestly, I had known for years that there was trouble brewing. And which I don't really think was a blessing. I think it was more, I think I was kind of given too much at too young of an age. But yes, I knew that something was wrong for a while. And so I don't think, from my perspective, that day wasn't as shocking in terms of like what it was happening, but it was more shocking like how it was happening.
I see. That makes sense. What advice for any parents listening or young people who like maybe want to convey information to parents? What's your advice for like how much they should share with their kids? And I know there's maybe two scenarios that I'm asking this in. One is like kind of an ongoing sharing of like seeking emotional support from your children, which we've talked about a lot on the show, has like a lot of dangerous pitfalls. But maybe more specifically with the actual event of like a separation or a divorce, like what's appropriate to share, what's appropriate not, like what you shouldn't you share, sort of thing. I'm curious if you have any principles or advice, because it is tricky, because like on one end, if you don't share anything, it leaves the kids sitting there like, I have no idea what's going on, I want some level of understanding. On the other end, if you share too much, it can be a huge burden too. I felt like there was, in our instance, and through no malice of mom or dad, I felt like there was maybe too much that was shared, where I feel like I wish I wouldn't have known as much. But I'm sure there's other scenarios of people listening where they like feel like they're even more so in the dark. So I'm curious what's the balance between the two, especially as it relates around the event of like a separation or a divorce beginning.
I think a couple of things. I think I think it's difficult for parents because I was definitely an inquisitive kid. And I wanted, I wanted to know why mom was upset. I wanted to know what was going on in different situations.
Yeah.
But that also ended up knowing those things at that age became a huge burden on me. And it kind of, frankly, to some degree, still has remained to this day. So I think a couple of guidelines. I think you shouldn't share anything that isn't like age appropriate, that they're not ready to like hear, or to maybe not even hear, maybe to deal with at that age. You know what I mean? And so and I also think that to some degree, like as a parent, you can't be just confiding in your child, you know what I mean, at a young age. And I think at any age, but I think particularly at a young age, like that your children shouldn't be the people you go to discuss these things with, because they're affected on both sides, right? So it's kind of not fair to only give them one side. But also I just think it gives them, it kind of puts an undue weight on their shoulders where they're already like carrying a weight, you know what I mean? And so I just think there's other terms that come in here, like triangulation and things like that. But I think like those are real things. And like when parents do that, it definitely can make it harder on the child than it needs to be.
If you'd like to share your story with us, we'd love to hear it. You can do that in 3 easy steps. But first, some of the benefits of sharing your story. Reflecting on your story and sharing it with someone who can receive it with empathy is actually healing on a neurobiological level and makes your brain healthier, according to neurobiologists. Writing your story is also healing. Studies have shown that people who write about emotionally significant events in their lives are less depressed, they're less anxious, they're healthier, and they're happier. And finally, it can be really helpful to someone who's maybe on the same path that you're on, but a bit far behind you, to just hear your advice and to hear your story, since they're going through things that you've been through. And so if you want to share your story, just go to restoredministry.com. You can fill out the form on that page that will guide you in telling a short version of your story, and then we'll take that and turn it into an anonymous blog article. Again, if you want to share your story now, you can do so at restoredministry.com/story, or just by clicking the link in the show notes. Totally agree. Yeah, and I love what you said about like the age appropriateness. I know sometimes parents may struggle to know what's age appropriate. One thing that I've heard said in different contexts is that you kind of let them ask questions. You maybe give them basic, simple information. And then if they're curious, you make an opportunity for them to like ask the questions, and then you kind of satisfy their curiosity and then leave it at that. You don't share more than that. I've heard that as kind of a guideline. Is there anything you would tweak or add to that?
I think that's a great guideline. And I also think you have to like kind of moderate your own desire to be heard, with balancing that with like your child's innocence, essentially, you know what I mean? And their right to be protected from, what is bad in this world. Not that you're going to perfectly insulate them, but I think when you let them know too much too young, it has kind of this, or can have this like, I don't know if the right term is eroding, but this effect of where it kind of matures them too quickly, and they miss out on some of these experiences and kind of like the carefreeness, for lack of a better term, of youth that I think is essential. And I think when you put too much on too young of a kid, they grow up too quick, and then they spend some of their adulthood, yearning after that carefreeness of childhood that they were somewhat robbed of.
Couldn't agree more. And we've seen that a lot with the different young people we've worked with. And it's really a tragedy. And what we've seen too is that, kind of to go a little bit deeper into that whole dynamic of like triangulation or spousification, where like one of the parents relies on usually one of the children or maybe multiple children in a way that they shouldn't, in a way that their spouse is really supposed to provide the support. But since they're not there, the children are kind of like the next convenient option. And so they, share things that normally they wouldn't share, they shouldn't share, in an attempt to like fill that very real need that they have. And so I like what you said about, kind of moderating your own desire to be heard, or what you said before, like you can take it to another source, which maybe isn't as convenient, like a relative, a sibling, maybe parents, a counselor, a pastor, friend, like someone like that. It's not as convenient because your children are right there and you can like share things with them, but I think it does more damage. And I think it's often what I've heard on this topic. We'll link to an episode from the awesome podcast, The Place We Find Ourselves, where Adam Young, the therapist, he goes into this in a little bit more depth, and he quotes some research and authors. But this whole idea, like it really can be so lethal, because the way he explains it, and you can jump in here at any point, he says basically like, mom or dad have like these real emotional needs, and then children are just there kind of wanting to help because they love their parents. And so they jump in and they listen and they empathize and maybe even like do things in order to help them. But then this unhealthy dynamic forms. And then over time, if that continues down that path, you have this really dysfunctional relationship, this unhealthy relationship that often leads to the child needing to pull away because they're like, this isn't healthy, but I don't really know what to do except like maybe leaving. And then the parent is hurt by that. And then often there's then resentment that seeps in, and then the child doesn't really want to talk to the parent. So that it destroys the relationship. And that's like over, if you look at it on like a longer time horizon. So we'll link to that episode. He says it more articulately than I can, but yeah, I thought that was like really interesting. And I think there's a lot of danger there that parents like really need to be aware of, especially if they're going through these like murky and painful waters of like separation and divorce.
And I sympathize like with our parents and with parents in general, because like you said, it's like the people you care about the most are your kids. And so it's kind of tempting because they're in it with you, right? Like nobody else is like in the war, if you will, with you, right? They're in the foxhole with you. So it's like very tempting, I think, to just like unload on them. And then you probably feel like, well, it's like they deserve to hear it. They deserve to know it, this and that. But that being said, I think, kind of as you mentioned, you're putting your child in a very difficult situation, not only for that short amount of time, but for, in a certain sense, the rest of their life, because they're going to have to navigate this difficult relationship that essentially had too much of a burden on one person for years and years.
Totally. Yeah. And I like what you said. Like, I think parents probably feel that burden of like, they deserve to know this. But I think what we would add is like, not all at once and not all the details.
Right. Exactly. And I think that, like, listen, there's in different stages of youth, we expose kids to different things, to different responsibility, right? Like whatever your opinion of sex ed or of the birds and the bees talk is, and who should give it, take that away. But at a certain point, you deem that your child is ready for that, right? At a certain point, you deem that your child is ready to babysit, that they're ready to drive, that they're ready to have a phone, all these different things, right? That they're ready to stay out past a certain time. And so it's a gradual thing. It has to do with maturity, with responsibility, but you don't deem it all at once. And sometimes in these situations, I think our parents just essentially break a lot of those barriers all at once. And then on a young mind, on a young heart, it's a lot to bear at, the age of 10, 11, 12, 13 years old.
I agree. I think if you want the best, healthiest relationship you can have with your kids, then you need to put a lot of like thought and prudence into what you're going to share before you share it. And I think that's another good principle of like, before you just kind of shoot from the hip and share something, like really give it thought. Is this something that they need to know, and to what level do they need to know it, and do they need to know it now? Maybe those are good questions.
And is it going to be good, good for them? And we're not, I think I can speak for you too, Joe. We're not advocating lying to your kids at all.
No.
Like we're not supporting that. But I remember this from my Christian moral principles class in college. I think it's from a book called Right and Reason. And this priest said, or I think he was quoting something, I think his name was Father Austin Fagothe. And he said, you always have to tell the truth, but you don't always have to tell the truth. In other words, like when you speak, you always have to say the truth, but you don't always have to speak, right? Mm-hmm. Or you don't know, you can just kind of say, you know what, this is not for this time.
Right. Would another version of that being like keeping things more general? Is that
right? Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. All right. And I'm curious, before we maybe go on in the timeline, how would you describe the marriage, the divorce, would you describe it as high conflict or low conflict? And just for everyone's context who's listening, high conflict divorces typically involve abuse, violence, maybe high degrees of dysfunction. And from the children's point of view, the problems are very overt and obvious. And so the children sometimes expect or even want a divorce or separation in those situations. That's like high conflict, where, yeah, there's a real like danger there that something needs to be done. Low conflict involves more covert problems. In these situations, children typically are like maybe blindsided by the separation and the divorce, or maybe they don't like fully see it coming. And so while they might know that mom and dad are facing some problems or some things that are wrong, they typically wouldn't expect a divorce, at least not like to the degree that you might think. So I'm just curious from your perspective, maybe like separate both of those instances of when we were younger, when we were older. How would you peg those? Were they high conflict, low conflict, somewhere in between?
I think it was kind of somewhere in between. Maybe I don't know if there's a medium conflict, but kind of like I think it fluctuated between those two. Certain periods of like high conflict. I don't think violence was typically part of the picture, but there was certainly a lot of like, I don't know, like I would say verbal abuse and just kind of like this overwhelming sense of like dis-ease that kind of pervaded over. And I think there was just like this like kind of underwhelming tension. Not underwhelming isn't the right, like like kind of like under the radar tension that like you couldn't exactly quantify, but you could feel. You couldn't maybe put a name on it, but you could feel. And I think I learned that years later. And so I think I would say, for all those reasons, kind of like it fluctuated, but probably more towards high conflict, like based on the level of dysfunction.
The way I have seen it, and this is just my perspective, so it's interesting again to see like even the kind of classification of low conflict versus high conflict might be dependent on the children's like perception to some degree. And I would say like the first separation for me was low conflict because it truly came out of the blue. It blindsided me. It sounds like you were more aware of like it leading in that direction. Mom shared things with you. She didn't with me. And so that like was blindsided me. And so that I would say was low conflict. Again, I knew there were some problems, but I didn't ever expect that to happen. Whereas when we were older and there was a second separation, that's when I would categorize that pretty clearly, in my opinion, from my perspective, as high conflict. That's kind of, but if we were to average them out, I think like in between or kind of different waves, like you said before, that would make a lot of sense. Would you add anything to that?
No, I would definitely agree that at the end, like it kind of reached its peak, at the end, the timeline we mentioned earlier, kind of that was the worst of the worst, if you will.
Yeah, no, totally. So I'm curious, this is a kind of a big question, but like, what was life like for you? You alluded to this already. What was life like for you during the separations, the divorce?
Ooh, it was very difficult. It was kind of hell, if I'm being honest. I think as I kind of had so like as, the early separation we mentioned, at that age, I kind of felt from that time that I was kind of like the man of the house.
Yeah.
And so that kind of like was hard, obviously at that age. But then, then dad came home and then it kind of was like a little bit of a relinquishing of those responsibilities or those duties. And then it kind of like came back into full. And I think like for me, I was growing up, I always wanted I was like a fixer, right? I wanted everything to be okay. I was kind of an intermediary. I remember a lot of times kind of getting in between mom and dad and trying to like talk them to the other person's side. So I guess like the image that I have to describe that time is that like your whole life, I think it's kind of like a tapestry being built. And what I felt like, when I was, 23, 24 and their marriage was coming apart and everything was ripped apart. I felt like it was this tapestry that was my life that was built together and kind of weaved together. And then as they got divorced, as it all happened, that it was like ripped, kind of like straight down the middle, and all these different times and years that had been weaved together were just kind of like ripped. And I think that's a really, a good, and with that ripping, it makes you broken and feel broken. And so like that whole time was like the hardest times of my life, and kind of dealing with the fallout. And I think the hardest thing for me was wanting to, when I've like talked to different people about it, in a lot of like family systems, there's a like hero child who wants to like save everybody. And I think I like identify with that a lot. And I think that it was hard for me because at that point I realized like I couldn't save everybody and I felt like, super helpless, so it's essentially kind of these two things going on, like the tapestry of my life is being, or our family's life is being torn apart. And at the same time, like I couldn't do anything about it. And that was like incredibly helpless. And it was the hardest thing for me was like to see my siblings suffer and to feel like that I couldn't give them what they need at the time, and that that was difficult, and yeah, and I think to another degree, kind of to take it to a different point, I think a lot of like how we reference God is through our family of origin, and a lot of those images we have of God is through that, and so for me, when mom and dad reconciled, I saw that as like a great sign and like a fact, kind of like a sign of that they were back together. And I considered it, as we mentioned earlier, like a small miracle. And then, so when that kind of fell apart, it was hard, like it was hard for me in my faith because I was like, wait a second, like I referenced this as like this miracle. And then it kind of ceased to be, so it left me questioning God and questioning where he was, and how he could let it fall to the spot.
Yeah, no, I've had similar struggles for sure. And it was almost like, without going into this too much, like each of those instances, like separation one, separation two, was kind of like were difficult in their own ways, and like were wounding in their own ways, and brought their own like unique kind of types of brokenness. Though there like was this continuum too along the way. So that was kind of my experience of it. But man, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, like it sounds like you were very self-aware throughout the entire time, which is not true for everyone. I'm curious, kind of, was there a point when you realized like that all the dysfunction, the divorce, the separation were affecting you negatively, or did you maybe always know that?
I think I always knew it kind of intuitively. I think like separation one, I had a lot of anger in me, and I knew it, kind of as it's kind of a, like we said the timeline earlier, but basically like 13 to 15, right? That's kind of like in a man's life, there's like, there's introducing testosterone and all these different things. So I had a lot of, kind of piss and vinegar and a lot of anger. Took out a lot of it like kind of on the sports field and just in like competition, because that was like I think my way of regulating myself. And after, you're like, yeah, I know, I've played sports against you.
You're always the measured one, never the violent one. You have some stories.
But yeah, I think that, that's kind of how it came out then. And then I think as a young, kind of like I've seen this in a lot of young people, a lot of siblings, I think like there's a lot of fluctuation in life and a lot of growth and a lot of changing, right? Your brain doesn't stop growing till you're 25 or 26. And so I think a lot of times you get to, like after college, and you think like everything's going to go like perfectly after that. And then you realize like, wait, I was actually talking this with some mutual friends of ours recently. It's like you get to that age and you realize like, wait, I have a lot of like unpacking to do from my my childhood, my adolescence, from my, the family I grew up in. And it's kind of, I think, starts at that point to manifest. So I guess it was twofold to answer your question, like, a lot of anger as a youth and a lot of kind of like hiding from the pain. And then as an adult, as a young adult, kind of having that trauma relived and not really being able to hide from it, having to deal with that. I think I dealt then with like a lot of anxiety and a lot of pressure and a lot of stress. And it just, it manifested itself in a lot of different ways.
Thanks for sharing. I know you've been through a lot for sure. I think there's a special, like for any firstborns listening, I think there's a special like burden, pain, and I don't know what the other words would be that the oldest two carry, like you said, especially if dad left the house, which is statistically, I think that's like the most common occurrence. Then you step into that role. And I'd imagine whether it's a boy or girl, they'd be kind of forced into helping around the house. And then I imagine, if mom were to leave, and that would kind of be a different dynamic of, especially the oldest girl. I don't know how that would play out. But anyway, that the oldest, I think, definitely carries like a big, big burden, and definitely saw you carry that over the years, which I appreciate, by the way. I know it's really like a lose-lose situation. Like in the military, when they're doing training with like, especially like special people in special operations, and I think probably like general like soldiers, Marines and things like that, they put them in these scenarios that are literally lose-lose situations where their only intent is like to humble them and to teach them that sometimes like you can't win and sometimes you have to just like minimize your losses. And that's the way I see the older children or any child like being put into some of these like parental roles, is it's like, okay, there's some level of necessity here. Like if that doesn't happen, then what's going to happen to the family and the kids? But at the other end, it's like, this really isn't good for them. They're not meant to fill this role. They're not meant to like, especially for a long period of time, they're not meant to like be this type of person. And so, yeah, I definitely am sorry you had to go through all that. But does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it definitely does. And I appreciate your kind words, Joe. Yeah, I think it definitely does. Like I definitely have, felt the burden of being the firstborn. And I think especially, I think there's, generally a burden being the firstborn. But in these situations, it kind of takes on a different meaning. And it kind of, really puts you in some of those like almost, it feels like do or die situations, you know what I mean? And the definition of lose lose is so fitting because like a lot of these situations when you're pitted against one of the parents or in between both of the parents, right? Like the definition of a dilemma is a dilemma. It's between two things. That is essentially what this is. You're between the two things of your parents. And it's like if you choose the old saying, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Like it's a bunch of those situations, just kind of like a continuous line of them. You just keep choosing and you pick one, you're damned, and you pick the other, you're damned, at least in your parents' eyes. And it's just like it's the lose lose. And so I think I think it is like I feel very deeply when I see children in these situations and particularly the oldest, because I know that, they carry a lot of weight and that a lot of like unfair things are put on them. And in a certain sense, like they're robbed of what should be happening at that age, like their childhood, their adolescence, their teenage years where they should be not thinking of, like I need to take care of all these things or take care of mom or take care of dad or take care of my siblings, or maybe I should go home now because my younger siblings like are missing me instead of just like being carefree and present in what they're doing.
Yeah, no, it's a totally different type of like upbringing that
yeah, it really is.
Yeah, that it really does like stunt your growth in a lot of ways. There's some benefits that come from it I've seen, like some virtues that can develop. But I think it does stunt your growth in a lot of ways. And I experienced some of that as well. And yeah, I remember a lot of people making the observation about like us, especially you and me. I'd imagine this somewhat goes down the line even further too, but just like being like more mature for our age. And that on the one level you think of it as a compliment, but when you kind of dig into it, it's like, wait, why are they more mature for the age? It's like, well, actually, that's not a great thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny you bring that up because that was a common thing said about us. And at the time you think like, yeah, I'm so mature, but it's, when you look at the reasoning, it's not as great.
No, totally. And I remember like getting along better with like older kids, like even your friends or even adults than I did like with kids my own age in some respect. Because I don't know if I could relate with them more. Yeah, there was like that. It felt like that we were kind of forced to that level. So without belaboring that too much more, I'm curious when it came to, just, you mentioned anxiety, you mentioned like pressure, stress, but were there any other emotional problems that you experienced through all of that?
How much time you got? No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
What do you think you are, Sarah Software?
Yeah. I love her.
Shout out to Sarah.
Yeah, shout out to Sarah and Dr. Andrew. Their podcast with you is my favorite one.
They're great, and I know they love you, they adore you, admire you, all the things.
They're awesome. So I think I think anxiety being the big one, and I think I want to be careful how I say this, but in those, in the situation of a family, like the father, like the role of the man, right, is to be the provider and the protector. And so when that is kind of inverted and you feel like you're protecting yourself from the protector, that becomes an entirely different situation. And I think it's like mentally really hard to wrap your head around that. And so I think that is a lot of like what I struggled with, is that and there's almost like some betrayal there, and some just questioning of like, oh my gosh, like wait a second, you know what I mean? This person who is supposed to be protecting me is like, this is like I feel like I'm having to protect people from this person. And so that is like a very vulnerable thing. I think that, definitely struggled a lot with anxiety. But even I would say a lot of anxiety was kind of centered around like performance of, I'm, having to achieve a certain level to basically to get noticed or to be loved. And not that my parents ever put me on that. I don't think that was ever their intent, and I don't think that they even were. I don't think that was anywhere in their intention. I think it's just like when you're in a tough situation like this, you just think that like, oh, like I better do something to get noticed and to be appreciated. And so like I, kind of ended up in a lot of like, sports or academics or things like being like just driven to this like level of like high achievement. And then like that kind of not being that satisfying. You know what I mean? And it's almost like was like, like anxiety, achieve the result, and then it's just like on to the next thing. You know what I mean? And so like it was and has been kind of a struggle for me, and kind of to disentangle my identity from my performance, because those are two entirely different things and don't affect each other.
That's really good. Like what you do is not who you are. It doesn't measure your value, your worth. Yeah. That's really good. If you come from a divorced or broken family, or maybe you know someone who does, we offer more resources than just this podcast. Those resources include things like a book, free video courses, speaking engagements, a free assessment, online community, and much more. All of our resources are designed to help you heal from the trauma that you've endured and build virtue so you can break that cycle and build a better life. And so if you want to view those resources for yourself or someone that you know, just go to restoredministry.com/resources or click on the link in the show notes.
And can I say something else about that, Joe? Like I thought, and to any, I know that this is a highly listened to podcast, that there's a lot of kids, and parents listening to this. And I would just say to them, don't equate your worth. It's good to be a high achiever. It's good to do the best you can in everything, right? I think it's somewhere in the wisdom literature. It's like whatever you do that with all your heart, which I believe wholeheartedly in. But I also think like that you are not what you do. You are not your GPA. You are not your batting average. You are not any of those things. Like you're loved by God just because who you are, just because you are. And so like in these situations where your parents' love seems very conditional because, you might be, kind of a victim of triangulation. You might be in between those two parents. But just know that like there is a love for you that is not conditional, and that's God's love, right? And that's not dependent on what you do, or not dependent on if you do what your parent wants you to do. That is love is free. And just to like when you are, caught in this web of kind of dependent love and people trying to buy love and things like that, just try to turn yourself the best you can to the love of God in the way you understand that. And maybe you don't, but maybe, all it really takes is just kind of just closing your eyes and just trying to turn yourself to him and just say like, God, like I need your love. Let me feel your love.
Yeah, because if he's all powerful and all-knowing, then he's going to be able to hear you in that moment and help you too. So, no, I know there's a lot there, and I know a lot of people do struggle in that relationship with God. Maybe we can go a little deeper into it in a little bit. But I think it's a really important point that I think by its very nature, separation and divorce point to like the conditionality of love, because it's like, okay, you're on your wedding day, you're promising your love to be essentially unconditional. And then, and feel free to disagree with that. And I think there's an importance between like unconditional love and unconditional maybe acceptance, because we never like loving someone, according to the kind of definition from St. Thomas Aquinas, is like willing the good of the other, right? And so the question becomes like, what is that good for in the particular situation? And how do I, in my role, do that? How do I will that? Love is not letting someone abuse you. That's not love. You can still love them in that moment, or not, maybe that moment's not the right word, in that situation where like you're maybe putting a restraining order in place, or you're calling the police or whatever that looks like, right? That's actually might be doing what's best for them, but it's not allowing like any sort of behavior. So I think that's kind of an important like side note when we talk about love, because some people maybe think of love as like accepting like any sort of behavior. But I think there is this like underlying message that like love is very fragile, love is very conditional, love can end at any moment. When you see your parents' love shatter before you, even if there were like decent reasons for their togetherness to be like paused or separated. Is that making sense?
It makes total sense. Yeah. And I think I was kind of trying to articulate that before, and I did a poor job, and I think you did way better. Yeah. Just this sense of love being kind of finite and kind of, performance based. You know what I mean? Because when you see your parents getting divorced because, one of them is behaving in a certain way, you start to think like, oh, well, if I am the best version of myself, am I going to essentially, is somebody going to divorce me from love? Am I going to be unlovable? And I think all of us struggle with that to some degree, but especially kids in this situation, because you see it crumble before your eyes. And so it's hard. Like, I know personally in my own life, that unconditional love that I just spoke about, it has been very hard to accept God's unconditional love because, it was not my experience of love. And so that's a struggle. And so I think you really highlight something very true, is because, we witness this kind of what we understand as love, or what we see as supposed to be love, like within a family. And then that ends, or that is broken down. Then we think like, we experience love as finite, or we experience it being cut off based on someone's failings, essentially. So then we are, essentially like, we feel that love is going to be taken away from us at any moment.
Yeah. And that, it makes it really hard to love in any relationship, including your relationship with God, but also friendships, romantic relationships, like go down the whole list. So let's go there for a little bit. The relationship with God, I'm curious kind of the particular struggles there for you. You mentioned them a little bit, but if you'd go deeper, and then kind of how did you work through that?
I'm still working through it, but I think like trying to, like my focus is trying to accept that unconditional love, and to know that like it's there. I didn't do anything to earn it, and I can't do anything to lose it, right? Like, I'm gonna say that again. Like, it's there. It's always been there for me. I didn't earn it. I can't earn it, but that also means I can't lose it. And so I think that's like both beautiful and hard to accept for someone kind of, who comes from a broken family, because you're like, wait, love is conditional? Like, I always had to do things to get love, So I think that is one thing. And I also think that kind of, so accepting that love has been difficult. One thing I've been kind of realizing is that essentially in life comes down to like what identity you accept. And there's this identity we all have from God, from either like a son or a daughter, and that is loved unconditionally by him. And then there's these false identities that are, pushed by the world or the devil or whoever you want to attribute it to. I think it's essentially, the devil through the world. But we are given these like lies about ourselves. And one of your guests, Dr. Bob Schutz, talks about this a lot. Like, these lies like kind of entrap themselves deep in our hearts. And then we kind of live out of this lie about ourselves and about our identity. And I think like essentially what life comes down to is like which identity you choose to live out of, either the true identity or the false identity or the lie. I know one struggle for me has been A, to like accept that identity from God, and then B, to live out of that. And, I think, if you look at our world, you kind of just see, a bunch of people struggling with identity and looking into all these different areas to try to find it and try to, or in some cases craft it or change it, or, with surgery or whatever, what have you. But like essentially what we have is, we have an identity from God that is not dependent on anything that we do. It's just essentially like unconditional love. And that is the one we are all thirsting for, but in a certain sense is the hardest one to live into, because it requires the most detachment from the lies that we have been told.
Yeah. No, there's a lot there to unpack. I think it's hard to like figure that all on your own. And I know we're going to get into kind of ways in which you've sought help, but I think it's like really important to like seek help for that from a mentor, maybe a therapist, spiritual director, someone like that. Because I think that's one of the things. I'm definitely no like academic when it comes to like identity, so I can't say I fully understand all of it, but I think one truth is that your identity is not something that you necessarily like create on your own. It's like something that's given to you. You can think of a child like receiving a name from a parent, right? Like they're literally in a very real way infusing an identity on you. And so I think like in a similar way, maybe there's some instances where we can kind of like create our own identity or like reach or discover our own identity, but I think it's always in relationship with like another person that we do that. And I think that's a really important component, because I think if you're just like sitting there kind of twiddling your thumbs being like, you know, I'm loved, I'm loved, I'm loved, or like whatever other kind of characteristic of your identity that you're trying to like fully like accept or embody, I think it can be quite fruitless in my opinion if you don't like experience it on like almost like a, maybe bodily level isn't the right term, but like in real life,
Tangible.
like, tangible, not just in your head. Because like you hear all these people in like the self-help, like personal development space who are like all into like these affirmations, or like, you know, they look in the mirror and they tell themselves things, and maybe there's a point to it. I've never done all of that stuff, but it's almost like that
Superman pose in the bathroom.
Yeah.
Superman pose in the bathroom. Yeah.
But there's like two things to it. Like, it's like, one, is there any evidence to back up what you're saying? That's really important, because otherwise you're like kind of delusional and fooling yourself. And two, you know, is there like, I think it's better for someone else to say that stuff to you than you to say it to yourself. And maybe there's not someone in your life who can say that, and so you need to, you know, kind of remind yourself of it, or maybe other people have said it, so you're reminding yourself of what they have said. So I think there can be some merit to it, but I think it's really important to have that like other person who's kind of somewhat infusing or imparting your identity to. That's why I'm such a big fan of like mentors. I think that's like so helpful and fruitful.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. You know, we're made for a relationship, and that is important. And it kind of plays into, you know, some of these relationships have given us these, you know, probably a combination of truth and lies about ourselves, about our identity. And so it's kind of, I think as an adult, it's kind of like choosing the relationships and also choosing to like try to, you know, engage in the relationships which help you to live into the true identity of yourself, you know. And so one of those relationships would be, you know, with God, and trying to say, okay, like, God, you know, there was this really holy priest I know, and he used to say when he was giving people, his name was Father Bernard Geiger, he died this past year, but he used to tell people to pray this prayer, and it was very simple. And he would give it at the end of confession. He would say, when you're doing your penance after confession, he would say, ask God, God, who are you and who am I? You know, it's a question of identity. And so like when you start what he was saying is that when you start to understand who God is, then you take on a different identity yourself, because that God's identity affects your identity. And so when you understand who God is and how much he loves you, that is going to help you answer the question of, you know, God, who are you and who am I? That is going to help you answer the question of who am I?
Dang, that's good. I like that. You mentioned before, like watching your siblings struggle has been the hardest thing. I'm curious what you meant by that, and if there are any particular like instances where that was kind of maybe grueling or kind of hit you in the face.
Yeah, I mean a lot. But yeah, just kind of seeing how, you know, I kind of, you know, being the oldest and being in the position I thought I was, you know, I was in a, you know, kind of in a sibling plus position, maybe you would call it. Like I felt like in a, you know, and I don't think it was healthy in a lot of ways, but I think I was in this kind of position of like a sibling parent. And so to see, you know, all of us struggle, all of you guys, I should say, struggle with the divorce, that was very difficult. And then also, you know, to feel that I couldn't help it. You know, I think because of how the divorce affected me so deeply, I felt that I couldn't be what I needed to be to the rest of the family. And that, you know, and I felt kind of in that time like I wasn't what I needed to be for all you guys. And so that was probably the hardest part of all that for me, is I wish that I could like just, you know, take away all that pain. And to accept that I couldn't was like really, really awful, you know. And I still struggle with that, you know, not that I should have been able to prevent it, but I wish that it affected me less. And so then I was able to help more, you know?
Yeah, no, I hear you. I definitely felt that. And it's humbling to see like your own limits, especially when you're trying to like love and help other people. And I definitely had many situations like you described where I wish I could have done the same for you and for our siblings. Yeah, it's just such a sucky situation to go through. And for the parents too, just to make sure I'm not like, yeah, we don't like, we have a heart for our parents for sure. We love them dearly. And yeah, even if there's struggles or even if there's things there that, you know, make the relationships challenging at times. Every relationship has their challenges, certainly. But yeah, it's just a hard thing for anyone and all of us to go through. So, but I think in a particular way, the children, because so often they get ignored or the pain is not even like acknowledged, very rarely understood and given like the space that it deserves, which is what we're trying to do here. But yeah, that I definitely can relate there. But yeah, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I've often thought that, like, in a divorce, particularly, that to some degree, like, like there's a saying, essentially, like you were referencing earlier with the lose-lose, but in a divorce, like, I think that nobody really wins in a divorce. But just to a certain degree, the parents get some change, and sometimes it is good change. I do believe in the case of our parents, it was good change, in fact, for both of them. Like, that's my personal perspective.
Sure.
But I think particularly, even though that is the case, I just think it's rare that it's better for the kids. Like, I think it's kind of the kids are particularly in a lose-lose situation. And so I think that that's like very difficult as a child, is because, we mentioned a lot of these situations where you're kind of a rock and a hard place. And that leads to this, like, I think one of the worst feelings you can feel as a human is helplessness, and I think it leads to a lot of helplessness as a child.
I'd agree with that. Yeah, you don't quite know what to do with it. I want to get into like that maybe happier, the better part of the story. But before we do, I'm curious if there were anything you wanted to add in terms of like struggles with bad habits or relationship struggles, especially in romantic relationships. I know there's probably a ton that we can say here, but yeah, just curious if there's anything you wanted to highlight.
Yeah, I definitely think, I struggle with a lot of things, but, I mentioned some of those before.
Sure.
I think, lust is one thing I struggle with, because I think, like, in a lot of these situations, we're looking for escape, and, lust offers the allure of that escape.
Totally.
But it's, essentially, it's at its core, it's a lie, and it leaves you, and the interesting thing, I saw a quote from Saint Jose Maria Escriva, and he said, after essentially, like, essentially after like giving into lust or sensual pleasure, like, what loneliness after? And it's so true that it, like, if you think of your life and you think of a time that you gave into lust or used it as like a medication, like, try to think of a time when you felt happier after. And the truth is, you won't, because you weren't. And so I think that, that has been something I think that a lot of people in general struggle with, but a lot of people in these situations. But I would just encourage anyone struggling with that just know it's not your identity. And it's also not, it's not a cure, and it's not helping you. It's just like making you more lonely. So that's what I would say to, like, the question of struggles. And then to the question of like relationships, I do think that it has definitely affected me a lot in my romantic relationships. And, I'm 35, I'm unmarried. And I think it's definitely part of the equation. I think when for me, like, seeing all that we have that we've mentioned in this podcast, it's hard to, like, really kind of like, or it has been hard for me to really want to, like, commit to love and commit to opening yourself so much to another person that you show them your flaws and you show them what's broken in you, because you also have seen, the negative effects of that. And so that has been very struggle for me. I'm still trying to work through it, still trying to essentially, help God, or let God help me through it. And so that's definitely been a struggle. And I think it is I see that trend in a lot of people who've been in similar situations.
No, thanks for sharing all that. And yeah, just one note on the whole lust thing. You guys have probably heard me talk about this in the show before, but Dr. Patrick Carnes is an expert on sexual compulsion addiction, and he found that 89% of people who struggle with a sexual addiction come from a broken family, what he called a disengaged family. 89%,
Right.
almost 90%, which is so wild. So I think it is such a common thing. On that note, we do have just want to give a plug we do have a podcast series on that topic. It's called Healing Sexual Brokenness. We'll link to that in the show notes. Definitely encourage you guys to check it out. If you're in any of the podcast apps, if you go to our show and you just search Healing Sexual Brokenness, you'll find that there too. But it's such a big problem. I think all of us at some level, or the majority of us, have dealt with it. And so, thanks for bringing that up. Kind of switching gears a little bit and getting toward the end of our show, I'm curious, kind of, when did you decide to ask for help, and what did that look like?
It took a lot of different forms. I've done different things in my life, like spiritual direction. I've done some counseling. I've done some trauma therapy. And then I've done other things that are kind of, less traditional. So one thing that has helped me a lot, actually, maybe the most, has been something called functional neurology. Essentially, it's a treatment for like brain injuries. And so a lot of people who struggle with anxiety, even in a lot of addictions, or excuse me, well, it's certainly addiction, but a lot of definitions for certain, mental illnesses or certain things carries the designation that, oh, this often ensues after a head injury. So something kind of in a just synopsis, I had a lot of head injuries, a lot of concussions, and I tried a lot through sports, car accidents, things like that. And I tried a lot of different things. And through a friend, I ended up trying this thing called functional neurology, which is 0% like has anything to do with counseling. It's just essentially physical therapy for your brain. And I found that like emotionally and like physically for me, that has had the greatest effect in terms of like, helping me improve, how I felt and how I behaved and things like that. And so like I would encourage anybody who, there's providers all across America. But I think oftentimes we take all this and we think, okay, if I go in a room and I sit with somebody and I talk about it, that will change. And certain therapy is great, and I've had a lot of great experiences with therapy. I've also had a lot of terrible experiences with therapy, and I think a lot of people would echo that. So I think like there is this element of, that therapy can fix everything in our time, like you hear all these commercials for BetterHelp and all these things. And where I think it's like very important, it's not the only thing. And so like we are mind, body, and soul. And the mind is just one of those. So, you can use the body and fix the body and try to heal the body. And so that has been something that has like really helped me. Physical activity has really helped me. Working out is kind of a great way to get unstuck. Doing some cardio, things like that are really good to kind of, help yourself move along in life and get past some of these things that have become hurdles in your life, in my opinion. I also, I dealt with a really good trauma therapist, Margaret Vasquez, who I know you've had on the show. And she does trauma therapy, and that was very helpful for me. So things like that, I think are good things. And I also think this, it's not a one size fits all for everybody. Everybody, just because something worked for someone else, it won't necessarily work for you. And I think that it's important to kind of, get to know yourself, your struggles, and kind of in a patient way, work on improving yourself. And essentially, I think that's what, brings peace. And it's important to not have the attitude of like, I'm going to fix myself. But I think it's the attitude of I'm going to open myself up so that God can heal me. Because you're not a machine to be fixed. You're a person to be loved.
Totally. And yeah, I think that's a really good distinction about like how we're not machines. I can't say I fully understand it, but I've heard it said that like we don't actually solve our problems, we outgrow them. And I don't totally fully understand that, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. How, whether it's like even a physical injury or something, we maybe don't go in and like fix the muscle tissue necessarily. Maybe there's some instances where you do that, but you kind of like build up the muscle around it and try to get like your body in a healthier space to where like you're better and healthier, and that kind of like resolves the issue. But it's not necessarily like, yeah, just tighten this bolt and we're all done. That's not how we work. Right. So I don't know. I have to give that more thought, but I heard that said, and I think there's some truth to it. I'm curious how, if there are any other like tools or tactics, books, podcasts, anything else, events that you have made use of that have been maybe the most helpful in your own healing journey of becoming like a better, stronger you.
Yeah, a lot of things. One thing I'm trying to think. I really like Dr. Jordan Peterson. I think he has a lot of good things to say. So he has a lot of, videos on YouTube Shorts. You mentioned Sarah Swafford. She's kind of helped me a lot. And she has a bunch. I feel like her talks are pretty wide ranging, but she has a book called Emotional Virtue, which is good. So those are just a few resources that are helpful. I also think there's I'm kind of fascinated by the mind body connection. Like we're not just our mind, we're not just our body, we're the unity and duality, as they say in philosophy. And so I think it's interesting how, you can like the body really affects, the mind and the soul and vice versa. And so like for instance, one thing, I had a very hard winter. I was in an accident and with my sister and we were both hurt pretty badly. And so I was, not feeling the greatest at all. And this one thing I found by this doctor, by Dr. Andrew Huberman, his name is, he's a neuroscientist from Stanford. He has this tip, he kind of has his morning routine out there, but he has this tip of like getting into morning sunlight within half an hour of when you wake up every day. And so for Lent last year, I did that every day, and it really helped like how I felt emotionally. And it kind of was what I needed at that time. So I think looking for little things and trying little things like that are going to help you is really important. And I also think like one thing that I've noticed in my life is something might help for a while and then it might stop helping. And that doesn't mean you're not doing it right. It just, you might have done all you can in that area. So don't just kind of like try to do it better or more perfect. If you've kind of exhausted it, it could mean that it's time to try something else.
Totally. No, that's great advice. And I love that connection you're making between like the body and your emotions, because on so many levels, like, yeah, your emotions like happen inside your body. And so there's certainly a connection there. It's not just like this random thing that happens like in your mind or some imaginary place. It's like very much so like a bodily based thing, especially anxiety. And you can feel it in your chest and your throat. Like it's certainly like there's certainly a connection there. And I've found similar benefits. It seems like the kind of healthier and the more fit I get, the more calm and peaceful I am. And so I think there's something to be said about that, which I know it can be hard for people to get started there. But if you can figure out some form of exercise that you really enjoy, that you kind of look forward to doing, that could help you. And it doesn't need to be complex. It can be simple. That can really help you get in, a much better headspace and even feel better emotionally, not just like physically. If you, like me, come from a broken family, you've probably experienced a lot of difficult emotions, and it's easy to deal with them in unhealthy ways. But one healthy habit that's helped me, working out consistently and eating how my body was made to be fed. It keeps my body healthy, and the endorphins help me feel happier and better navigate tough emotions. But I know it's not easy to start exercising or to be more consistent with it. You might be thinking, I don't know what I'm doing. I have no time. I'm too unmotivated. That's why I trust and recommend Dakota Lane. He's a nationally certified fitness and nutrition coach who's helped 1,000+ clients, from beginners to even pro athletes. As a devout Catholic, he creates personalized fitness and nutrition plans with 24/7 support and one-on-one coaching. And since it's all online, you can literally work with Dakota anywhere in the world. One client said, Dakota changed my life. His program is worth every penny. If you've struggled to change yourself for the better, Dakota is your man. To see what Dakota offers, go to dakotalanefitness.com. Dakota is actually giving away for free his PDF guide, The Biggest Fitness Mistakes to Avoid. You can download that at dakotalanefitness.com/restored. Again, that's dakotalanefitness.com/restored, or just click the link in the show notes.
Yeah, and here, that's a great point, Joe. And a really good, honestly, one of the best things and a really good place to start is something that most people can do. And it's just something that's very regulating. And Margaret Vespa taught me this, is just taking a long walk and just kind of, just letting your thoughts wander and just like process what's going on within your life. And the act of walking, you're using your whole body, you're using essentially kind of all your senses. It's very integrating for your body. And there's been so many times in the last couple of years where I feel like very kind of frustrated or aggravated or very emotional, and I go for a long walk, and I'm talking like usually like half an hour to like an hour. And by the end of it, I come home and I feel in a certain sense like I worked out a lot of what was bothering me. And I think it's because you're moving, you're using your whole body, and it's also giving your mind a chance to essentially like kind of run through or walk through everything that's going on.
That's really good. A similar process, from my understanding of like neurobiology, happens when we sleep. Like our brains kind of like process things and like file them away. Kind of like if you've seen the movie Inside Out, like that's essentially what happens when we sleep. Like our memories are being like filed away in long-term memory and things like that. I don't understand all the ins and outs of the science, but that I've heard, it's been helpful for me too, walking and kind of like moving your body. Cause I think especially today, like in years past, like we were so active as humans. Now we're just so sedimentary, like we just sit on computers and on couches and we're not moving our bodies. And I think it's having like really detrimental effects on so many levels. So I love that. I love what you said. And no, I think that just like this whole body-based thing is like kind of that whole quote, get out, like mind over matter. You've heard people say mind over matter. I've heard people say like body over mind, where like if you kind of like get outside of your mind and into your body, like there's something really good there that it's actually helpful in healing. And that's like something, especially in moments where I've been the most anxious or even like sad or depressed, like that is incredibly helpful in healing. The other thing I was going to mention there too is just how I've been learning this more and more, whether it's through from guys like Huberman or others, like Dr. Peter Attia, or I was recently watching this series on Disney Plus called Limitless. It's with Chris Hemsworth, and he has all these health experts like Dr. Peter Attia on the show, kind of talking about like health and well-being. And one of the things I've learned from them is like the sleep is literally the foundation of health. Like it's literally the foundation of all health. Like the other things are, so sleep is like everything more or less. And then you have like nutrition, and then which includes like drinking water and eating like clean, healthy foods. And then you have exercise. So like exercise is like super, super helpful, and I'm a big proponent of it, but like we need to make sure we're getting those other two things right, especially sleep. So if there's only one thing you can get right now, if you're listening to this and you're like, I'm overwhelmed, I can't do everything, try to get your sleep down. And that's going to help you. And you might need exercise or like healthy eating to do that, which is, it all works together. But I think there's something to be said like of that being like the focal point. Because once you get that right, your body and your brain can actually like heal itself. And then you can get into this better spot emotionally. And then you'll be able to, you know, maybe even further hone in like your diet, like what you're eating and the quality of what you're eating. And then from there, if you get those things dialed in and you add exercise, that's like the golden combo. So that's just wanted to throw that out because it's been helpful for me, in case that's helpful for anyone listening.
Yeah, and I would just add to that that it's kind of like a snowball effect, or it has kind of an avalanche effect that once you start doing a little bit in one area, you know, it it produces the dopamine that your body is looking for, and you know, essentially you want more dopamine, you go back to it, and you get healthier and healthier. And so I think that it's like a very healthy process. So like sometimes all it just takes is just going to the gym once, or going on a walk, or going on a run, or just playing a sport, just doing something to move your body, and then just trying to stack those days on top of each other, and eventually you're going to feel a lot healthier. Like no one, have you ever heard anybody say like, man, I really wish I didn't go to the gym today? Like, no, you haven't.
Totally.
And I think, and there's a reason for that.
That's really good. Let's talk a little bit about therapy. So I know you have some thoughts and opinions on therapy, so I wanted to make sure we spend a little bit of time talking about that. So you mentioned that you found help through therapy, especially trauma therapy in particular, but yeah, what's maybe some of the nuance and any guidance for anyone listening on this topic as well?
So I have a lot to say about this, but I'll try to keep it short. I think a couple of things. I think one important thing is fit with you and a therapist. I think another thing is not kind of that the goal of therapy is to help your life, and it's not to like center your life around the therapy, which is something I've kind of struggled with. And then I think that essentially a good therapist is someone who's going to help you and is going to like refuse to like make decisions for you, or refuse to kind of, for lack of a better term, like kind of boss you around too much. You know, I think that especially as an adult, like you want someone who's going to empower you more to like to live your own life and live an adult. So I've had kind of like almost like a 50-50 spread of good experiences and bad experiences. So some people have been very helpful, some people have been almost like hurtful. But I think it's important to talk to somebody. So try it. If that person doesn't work, well, you can try another person. You know what I mean? Or try a different type of therapist or a different type of person to talk to. I also think like, you know, having other people who you're not paying to talk to is helpful, and who you trust and who know you. Because I think a lot of times the struggle with therapists is like, you know, they've talked to you a couple of times, they don't really know you. And you know, it's important to have a balance of that and people who know you and have seen you, you know, grow up, or know your life and know who you are, and sometimes they can better advise you on what you need to do. But I'm not like, I don't mean to say this to dissuade therapy, but I mean to say that it's one tool in a, you know, a whole tool belt of different tools. And so I think sometimes there's too much emphasis given on it. And in particular, there's this therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, which is essentially like the idea that if you think differently, you change your life. And that is true. If you think differently, you do change your life. However, most of us think a certain way for a reason. And it's not just a matter, or as simple always as just changing our thoughts. So sometimes we have to change our behavior. And actually, like, so I've heard it said that the easiest way to change behavior is to change identity. And so that goes back to what we were saying earlier, like living into like your true identity as, a child of God and as someone who's loved unconditionally can really help you change your behavior more than anything.
That's really good. You made me think of something Dr. Greg Bottaro said in a recent episode. He was talking about how just kind of this whole idea of like talk therapy is not enough. And I forget exactly what words he put to that, but he did talk about like the role of our subconscious, and the like kind of lame person understanding that I have of it is that the way that we think, the way that we act, the way that we feel is a byproduct of like what's in our subconscious. So like that's essentially controlling our life. And there's a quote from this Swiss psychologist that we talked about in that episode who said something along the lines of like, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. And so basically the idea is that like you're saying, I don't think like changing the way you think isn't as easy as it sounds. That's the whole point of making it. Because what happens in life is like we go through these experiences, we kind of sustain these wounds, and they get lodged in our subconscious, like below our conscious minds, the thing that we're like actively thinking about. And then those things, kind of like the mass below the tip of an iceberg, are there influencing the way, again, we think, the way we feel, the way we act. And so if we are just staying on the level of like our, trying to think differently on a conscious level, and we never go kind of into that mucky water of like the subconscious and like figure out like, well, why do we think and feel that way? Or, is there like trauma there that's literally affecting us on a physiological level that's maybe preventing us from thinking and feeling in a different way? Then we're always going to be stuck in it. That's my perspective. And so John Paul II, actually, in Love and Responsibility, to everyone familiar, John Paul II wrote this book when he was like a priest, a professor, called Love and Responsibility, on like relationships and sexual like morality, things like that. And he, in the end of that book, Dr. Bottaro was teaching me that he had like this whole part about the subconscious, because around that time when he was writing it, Sigmund Freud was very popular. And so Freud like really emphasized like the role of the subconscious. So JP2 actually took that and he kind of emphasized how no, like we need to kind of take what's in the subconscious out, objectivize it, meaning like we need to inspect it and look at it and understand it in order to be able to act, think, and feel differently. I'm putting some of my own words to that, but I thought that was interesting. I haven't read Love and Responsibility cover to cover. I've read parts of it, but do you recall that from reading it? And any further thoughts?
I don't recall that, but it sounds very interesting. I want to go back and read it now.
Yeah, and I don't know the pages, or else I would have said it, but I think it's towards the end. And I was talking to ChatGPT about it, and it was found, I think, the section, so you can do that if you like. So yeah, any final thoughts on that? And then the other question I had for you was just, yeah, I guess after kind of going through this process of like healing and growth, if how your life might look differently now, just in order to encourage people to push through the pain and the discomfort that often hits you in the face when you're trying to heal and to grow and to be better, stronger. So I'm just curious if you have, just if you would kind of contrast to how life was and how it is now, though we're always a work in progress.
We love comfort to a large degree, right? And part of us, is like our brain's job is to keep us safe.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times what our brain tells us is, don't do anything scary or different or change anything. And that is the temptation for those of us who have really been, in these difficult situations, because, we, change is scary and change has, been very hard in our lives. But I would just encourage you to, A, to go at your own pace, B, to seek ways to heal yourself, or seek ways to, dispose yourself to healing, because, we were made to be healed. I think a lot of our intuition is that, this is like, I can be healed here. I need to be healed here. And I heard one of my favorite priests, Father James Serby, has a really good podcast called Holiness for the Working Day. And he said that, in Jesus' time, he performed a lot of healing because, back then they didn't have a lot of physical healing. He did a lot of physical healing. He said, but now we're pretty good at physical healing. So what we really need is, spiritual healing, emotional healing. And Jesus wants to heal us, right? Like he wants that for us. He wants us, he said in the Gospel of John, I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. He didn't say, I came that you might suffer and, stumble through life and then, die. He wants us to have abundant life. So I think like having the courage to see past your circumstances and to try to, get better is important. I would also say that, healing, and this is something I've had to learn the hard way. I thought healing was kind of a destination and you get there and you're done and you kind of check the box and you put the file away and then you live the rest of your life.
Hmm.
But I've learned that healing is a process and you're going to be on that journey the rest of your life. But I think it is, I think it is a process that is worth endeavoring in.
Good stuff. Two final questions. If you could speak honestly to mom and dad, I'm curious, like, what would you say? And to whatever degree you're comfortable talking about that.
Oh, wow. Best for last, huh? Wow. Okay. So, yeah, I think that, I heard this quote recently and it's really stuck with me. And it's that we're mad at our parents because their parents messed them up and then they messed us up. You know what I mean? And it's kind of like, I think that's like a pretty revealing quote because I know, you think very often, and now you're a father, so maybe you can speak more to this, but you think very often, if I were a parent, I'd do it this way. If I were a parent, I'd do it this way. If I were a parent, like when I'm a parent, I'm going to be perfect, or I'm not going to do all these things that my parents have done to mess me up. But then, as you get older in life, you realize that that's not really the reality, and that a lot of, our parents, I would say to mom and dad, I know they both went through a lot. And I think that that is, that was very difficult for them. And I think that a lot of like what we've been through or they put us through was a result of that. So, in a large sense, it's not their fault. You know what I mean? So I would just tell them both that I love them and I'm thankful for them and for the love they have given me, because they have given me a lot of things and they have loved me, both of them. And so like I would say thank you for that. And I think in the end, I hope that they heal as well as me.
I love that. Well, thank you for coming on, for going so long. I'm sorry this went so long, but you have a lot of wisdom that I wanted to make sure everyone was able to benefit from. And yeah, thank you so much for just sharing so vulnerably and again, imparting all that wisdom. I just want to give you the final word. You kind of went through some of this already, but I just want to give you one last chance. What advice or encouragement would you offer to maybe the younger you who's listening right now?
I would just say to my younger self that I would say that, you're going to go through some difficult things. It's going to be very hard, but, you're going to make it and it's going to be okay. I think that, we've highlighted a lot of things that, have gone wrong or have been hard, but we also maybe haven't mentioned, that we're both here and we're both doing okay. And, we're making it, and things aren't perfect, nor are we perfect, but we're making it. And so I would just encourage, that younger self to not define itself by the lies, that seep in from the world or from different wounds. And I would also tell that younger self that, to seek healing and to seek the truth. And, it's okay. It's okay to struggle. Like, I think it's okay to struggle, and that, God, one of the scripture verses that I hold to is God works all things to good for those who love him. And in one of my favorite books, St. Augustine says, even their sins, so God is using everything for our good, even our mistakes. And so, if essentially, I think what life comes down to is just abandoning ourselves to God and letting him kind of scoop us up and essentially take us where we need to go. And so I would also say, that in different things that I'm proposing is like, I do not have it all figured out. I am very much, to be honest, I almost didn't even want to come on this podcast because I felt like a little bit of a hypocrite. I'm like, I don't have this all figured out. How can I go on and talk about my life or tell other people like this is how you should do it? But I guess what I would say is that like, maybe the importance is not like in the destination, but it's more like in the struggle to get there, in the journey to get there. And I think that's what, in that way, we help other people, we help ourselves. And I think God sees that struggle in us and he is pleased with that.
A few final thoughts. Due to the time limit and the nature of this podcast, we didn't really get a chance to talk about the good things about our family, and there's plenty to say. One thing I would say is all of us siblings are actually pretty close to each other. We say as close as our lives will allow. We have good relationships, and we love our siblings. Anthony and I know I can speak for him, saying like we really love our siblings, and personally, they're just a huge motivation for me for doing this podcast and the work that we do at Restored. And although there have been struggles over the years with our parents, we really love our parents, and we appreciate all that they've sacrificed for us. us. For example, my mom has always just fought really hard for us to be physically healthy from a young age, even when it wasn't very popular. And then my dad always worked really hard for us to provide. And he really gave us a great example of a hard work ethic, which I totally see in all of my siblings. And that's just to mention a few. Definitely grateful for my parents. And although, our story has some sad and heavy parts, there's a lot of good to it as well. If you want to contact Anthony, just see the show notes for his email. He's open to that. And lastly, we really hope that this conversation acted as somewhat of an experiment or maybe a template for how you might talk with your siblings about your parents' divorce or family dysfunction. You could even send this episode to your sibling or siblings and invite them to listen and perhaps discuss it with you next time you guys see each other. And if you don't have siblings, you could always do this with a close friend, or maybe if you have a good relationship with one or both of your parents, you could do it with them as well. Just an idea that we wanted to throw out to you. That wraps up this episode. If this podcast has helped you, feel free to subscribe or follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever podcast app you use. Not only is that the best way to avoid missing future episodes, but the more subscribers we have, the more the apps will suggest our show to people who are looking for help. And it only takes a few seconds. If you've already done that, feel free to rate or review the show. That also helps listeners find the podcast, and we definitely appreciate that feedback. In closing, always remember you are not doomed to repeat your family's dysfunction. You can break that cycle and build a better life, and we're here to help. And keep in mind the words of C.S. Lewis, who said, you can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending.